Welcome, welcome. Good evening. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to thank Kara Bauer, Emily Moody, Carrie Slattery, and Brittany Nazario, and the entire wonderful team at the Cummer for bringing Searching for Identities Cultural Series literature to you here this evening. If you've attended before, you probably know that Cindy and me, yes, are, well, a little bit unconventional. So although we had planned on introducing ourselves the old-fashioned way, we've decided to take a different approach. So if you're interested in our backgrounds, you can just check out the link in the chat. Meantime, since today's theme is comfortably mysterious, here are some mysteries revealed to you that we think we'd be very comfortable sharing with you. Now, Cindy claims to be an open book, but we know that could not be true. Naturally curious, I have dug below the surface and learned just a few tidbits about her that you might find worthwhile. So everyone thinks that her favorite artist is Rembrandt. And after all, he was the subject of the first major art exhibition that her mother took her to in Chicago when she was just a little girl. I can visualize it. His portraits deeply affected Cindy, and she wondered why he looked so unhappy, revealing his troubles right on the surface. But since then, Cindy has taught AP art history, which is no mystery, and she sought to make the subject matter relevant. So she pivoted to the 20th century German artist Anselm Kiefer, who is admired for his re-examination of German history, synthesizing mythology, philosophy, culture, and literature onto a monumental scale with stunning, powerful results. Cindy also likes another Cindy Sherman, who tackles feminism in photography. But we could go on. Cindy?
Thanks, Stacey. It is hard picking just one favorite artist, but here we go with Stacey's introduction. It wasn't until Stacey prepared for tonight's discussion that she realized her love affair with reading began in, are you ready, Temperance, Michigan, with mysteries. As a young reader, Stacey adored the Red Room murder mystery, Harriet the Spy, and the classic book, From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. Who doesn't love a good Elaine Konigsberg? But Stacey, no Nancy Drew? No wonder today she turned her passion into a profession, working with words. Another mystery I have not been able to determine, just how many book clubs does Stacey Goldring run? Oh well, guess we'll have to remain in the dark on that one. All right, Stacey, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Cindy. Well, the first time I heard about A Woman in White was from a dear friend a few years ago. She described the book as the first great detective novel. The name of the book's author was Wilkie Collins. Well, the first thing that came to my mind is simply, I cannot stand it when people have two last names. And the reason is I get mixed up. I don't know which name comes first. But setting aside this one item on a long laundry list of things to which I take great illogical umbrage, I am nevertheless forever indebted to this friend who introduced me to the mysterious Woman in White. Full disclosure, upon the recommendation of the book, I did a little research on this author of two last names, and I discovered that he also wrote a book called The Moonstone. So I decided to read that one first because I just like the cover better, and there's a better picture of it over there. So now that confession's out of the way, here's the weirdest thing that happened to me while I was reading A Woman in White. I kept getting this deja vu feeling, and not the kind you get when you're about 20 pages into the book and you realize, my God, I already read this already. And you know that's happened to you. Anyway, it was like a haunting familiarity. And it wasn't because I just recently read The Moonstone. It was kind of like a aha deja vu. Now, I am not some mystery reader aficionado. I've only read one Agatha Christie, the most critically acclaimed, and then there were none. And why would I ever read Endeavor when I can watch that handsome detective play his part on PBS? He's so cute. So through a bit of research, I deconstructed why I was having this weird feeling. By reading The Woman in White, I was treated to a behind the scenes tour, like this beta look at a prototype of the origins of all the suspenseful detective mystery novels that have come since. Here's an example to get us started. Okay, so I'll share with you the most obvious influence of Wilkie Collins on the pages, plot, and character of everyone's favorite detective, the pipe-smoking Sherlock Holmes. Our dear Mr. Holmes emulates many of the traits first seen and created in Collins 20 years plus prior to Our Man at 22 Baker Street. So with Sherlock, we think of the quintessential hat and pipe, as seen on this cover here on the left. He is our sleuth original, but au contraire, he is not. The idea of problem solving with pipe or cocaine, if you watch the Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, was actually a Wilkie Collins literary invention, hence as seen in the book at the right called The Dead Secret. A three-pipe problem is mentioned in Doyle's Red-Headed League, and that's published in 1891. Note when The Dead Secret was published, 1857. So I've pulled the quote below for you to read, stated by the sleuth character in the novel. I find this very interesting. But more clues in Collins' work shall now be uncovered. Are you a fan of BBC Masterpiece Theater? Does Miss Marple make you smile? Well, I don't know about you, but I certainly enjoyed Grantchester. So just remember that the next time you appreciate the persnickety Hercule Poirot reconstructing a murder scene at the Majestic Hotel, or the diaphanous Phryne Fisher, always several steps ahead of the bumbling policeman, well, you have to tip your hat to Wilkie Collins. And P.S., the books that, the Phryne Fisher books, written by Carrie Greenwood, they are much racier than the TV version. So Cindy, just think about that. Well, very, very risque. So why do we tip our hat to Wilkie Collins? It turns out that Collins is indeed the grandfather of all detective fiction. His writing can claim to have established the genre with several classic features of the 20th century detective novels that we know today. So the following should sound comfortably familiar. A country house robbery, an inside job, a celebrated policeman with a touch of amicable eccentricity, a bungling local constabulary, detective procedures, false suspects, the least likely, a locked room murder, a reconstruction of the crime, and then a final twist plot. Wilkie Collins can also claim these firsts: the first British detective story, appearance of a police officer, a woman detective, a humorous detective story called The Biter Bit, first canine detective, and in 1854, in a book called Hide and Seek, we find the first portrayals of a deaf character in English literature. But wait, Wilkie Collins' influence on detective fiction goes on. You may be aware of the Holmesian philosophy. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Sherlock first shares this with us in The Sign of Four, published in Lippincott's Monthly in 1890 and pictured on the left. But do a little digging and reach into the pages of Wilkie Collins' novel, My Lady's Money, and you will find the same comment made by a sly character appropriately named Felix Sweetstir, published 20 years prior. Now, this is not to say that Doyle stole anything. We are all inspired by art and life. I'm sharing this information with you because, frankly, it's fascinating. And it is a shame that Collins does not get equal billing as Doyle. So perhaps today, by coming together, we rectify this injustice. Do you find it impossible to believe that Sherlock's traits were not singularly created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? Well, according to the precept, however improbable, this must be the truth. Collins is truly the godfather of the who-dunnit.
You will not follow my precept. How often have I said to you, that once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
What exactly does that mean?
It means that if we cannot have fired those torpedoes, someone else did.
Watson, how often have I said to you, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth? Oh, very often. Very well then, it applies now.
Future? If you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
Okay, I just have to say he's very hot. Okay, so it's clear understanding Collins' influence further offers proof that reading good literature assuages our ambient worries and comforts us during our present pandemic times. Certainly you found something in that clip that was comfortably familiar. So it seems only fitting, now that we clearly can see Wilkie Collins' influence on the genre of detective fiction, we need now to look at this sensational bestseller.
You will not follow my precept.
Up there, okay. So who is the woman in white? Uncover a bit about the mysterious Wilkie Collins unstory is where we're going to go next. And then I'm going to wrap by defining why, despite logic, readers find comfort in tension and mystery. The opening lines of Wilkie's Woman in White sum up the book quite well. This is the story of what a woman's patience can endure and what a man's resolution can achieve. The story is typical Wilkie Collins. It is revealed through the faceted lens of all these characters as if they are subpoenaed before us, the reader. They tell their version of the woman in white. And with each new chapter of testimony, we simultaneously begin to understand what has happened, and we also become more perplexed as what is to come, developing this labyrinthian tale of tension and suspense. So here is the intro. We find the handsome artist Walter Hartright. You have to love that name. On the eve of him, prior to setting out for Limmeridge House, where he's on a commission for a painting instruction with two sisters, he is walking down a deserted road where he literally runs smack into this frantic, apparently frightened woman, or is it a ghost dressed in white? As he comes to her aid, he helps her find a carriage to escape he does not know what. Then he witnesses and overhears two men in a desperate search for a woman who he hears has escaped from a mental asylum. Now fast forward and picture two sisters who are best friends that reside at this idyllic Limerick house. Their mother, gone from this world, had two daughters, Marion Halcombe, the eldest, rather frumpy and actually a little hairy. I don't know. Sadly, we learn that Marion's father died and her mother remarries a man named Fairley. Tragically, Laura's mother and father die, leaving both half-sisters as orphans and wards residing at Limerick, the home of Laura's uncle. Now, this man, Farley, is a first-class raving hypochondriac, and he wants nothing more to do than get the niece married off so he can forget all responsibility of managing her wealth and focus on the important things in life, like his headache and his sensitive ears and his mediocre art collection. Well, our hero comes to Limerick House, and just imagine, he absolutely gasps when he sees the beautiful younger sister, Laura Fairley, for the first time, an angelic reincarnation of the vision he just saw the night before. She's also, of course, wearing white. The resemblance is uncanny, but he quickly shakes away the disturbing contradiction because, of course, he falls in love. But our Laura has promised to fulfill a pact made between father and uncle, which means marrying the evil Sir Percival Glyde. Now, the name alone tells us this guy is a slick character, and I'm not going to give away the plot, but you can probably guess that Glyde's love for Laura resides mostly in her bank account. It is clear to Walter and Laura that Glyde is up to no good. Plus, there's a new friend on the scene, this slovenly, tubbing, charming man with a penchant for caged birds and mice in his pockets, Count Fosco. With his dripping, sinister charm, it is clear these people need to escape. Further chapters reveal that the woman in white is seen in the village as a ghost, but Laura does finally see her in the light of day, and she warns her, do not marry Sir Percival Glyde. But the warning comes too late, and Laura vanishes. What follows exposes the trials and tribulations of a woman's lack of rights and identity. We find asylums that lock up women who are considered too strong-willed, doctors who are paid off for fake diagnoses, loyal servants, bogus illegal contracts, stolen identities, kidnapping, burial, gaslighting, exhumations, murder, secrets, promises, and betrayals fly through this plot. And it is hard to keep up. The reader is like a jury, trying desperately to solve the identity of a woman or a ghost, and whatever happened to Laura. I am just getting started, and this story has a complicated timeline and tension builds on each and every page. And The Woman in White is based in part on a true story, on an 18th century case about the abduction and wrongful imprisonment of a French woman. The book uses the theme of substituted identity, just like what happened to the woman you see pictured here. And this was a favorite theme of Colin's. And he also loved to write about the injustice and misuse of insane asylums, as they were called at the time, in muzzling women. Now, just explaining this to you is quite frankly exhausting and excruciating. And trust me, each chapter ticks like a Swiss watch, intricately building curiosity and suspense until at last a solution meeting the standards of Victorian virtue comes to a close. Now, as many of you know, the topics of identity and behavioral health are incredibly dear to me. So it is no wonder I take comfort in A Woman in White. Our book was serialized in Charles Dickens' magazine all the year round, from November 1859 to August 1860. Then came the book, which reached 8 editions by November of that same year. The story flew off the shelves. Multiple books and plays followed. You'll see here throughout the rest of these slides that I've actually peppered some quotes throughout so you can get a flavor for the delightful wit and why so many people loved Colin's stories. This Woman in White was popular not only in Europe, but in the United States, and it firmly established his reputation with the reading public. It was so popular that one critic said that every possible commodity was labeled Woman in White. There was Woman in White cloaks, bonnets, perfumes, toiletries, Women in White waltzes, and quadrilles. It was even parodied in Punch. Prince Albert read it and he approved. It was said that Prime Minister Gladstone found the story so absorbing that he missed an evening at the theater. The Woman in White has never, ever been out of print, and it has been captured on film, theater, radio, television, in musicals, and even a comic strip. So I'm going to leave it here for you to read the rest, and I'll just sit here and wait for you to read it. Just kidding. It's a very thick book. But I'm going to leave it here for you to decide if you would like to read it or not. But I warn you, it's not for everyone. You have to be a lover of detail, someone who is equally satisfied with plot, detail, character, landscape, and most of all, a lover of problem solving and suspense. So you know about the story. Let's look at Wilkie's life. And I know what you're thinking. There was an article in the New York Times about how we use auto fiction for everything. We're reading into things. So just forgive me for the next few minutes. Born in 1824, William Wilkie Collins was the son of a well-known landscape painter, William Collins, and his mother was Harriet Gies. He and his younger brother, Charles, had a pretty posh life. The family lived in England and they lived in Italy, where Collins became fluent in French. Back in England, he was sent to boarding school in Highbury. Now that's west of London, but before you get to Port Wynne. You won't be surprised to hear that while in boarding school, heavens upon heavens, Wilkie Collins was bullied. So this one young man who was so completely cruel to our man Wilkie Collins also insisted that Collins tell him a bedtime story every night before going to sleep. And obviously this turned out to be a pretty good thing. In Collins' own words, quote, "It was this brute who first awakened me, his poor little victim, a power of which but for him I might never have been aware. When I left school, I continued storytelling for my own pleasure," unquote. Now at 17, Collins left school when his father, eager to establish his son in some respectable way, arranged for him to apprentice as a tea merchant, where Collins stayed miserable for the next 5 years. Then in 1843, he published his first story. Soon to follow, as in every great story about every great author, Collins received his first official rejection letter. And this was in 1845. And subsequently, the novel was never published. It was at this time where Collins' father accepted the fact that his 20-year-old son would not stay in the tea business. He would also not follow in the father's own business of becoming a painter. And he also rejected another option presented to him. How about the clergy? So when all else fails, the father's final suggestion, why not become a lawyer? So off Colin goes to law school. It's 1846, through connections made by that determined, supportive dad. And there he works very hard at socializing and writing. One would think perhaps Collins could write a book in praise of his father's life with a chapter dedicated to the patience of parenting. Well, he did write about his father. A year after William Collins passes, Wilkie produced his first published book called Memoirs of the Life of William Collins, Esquire of the Royal Academy. Meet the gang. Now, it is a shame that Colin's father did not live to see him practice law, but that's really okay because actually he never did. You could say that the stars did align for Collins in 1851, where he was introduced to Charles Dickens, who you'll see on the left. They became lifelong friends and collaborators, with Collins having many of his works serialized in both of Dickens' magazines, Household Words and All About Town. And they also collaborated and performed in plays together. They even attracted the royal attendance of the approving Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And if you look to the slide, look at the photo on the right, you'll see Dickens kind of out in the very front row and our Wilkie Collins very contemplative on the right-hand side of the second row up with the beard. Now in 1853, Collins suffered what was probably his first attack of gout, which would plague him for the rest of his life and lead to an addiction to opium. Now here's an interesting tidbit. He has a work called The Lazy Tour of Two Idle Apprentices, based on a walking tour that he and Dickens took one summer, and it was serialized in Household Words. So I told Cindy, if literature doesn't work out, we can write our own book about the lazy tour of two apprentices. So far, we seem to have a pretty straightforward life about a successful author that had some nice breaks and a pretty supportive father. So let's pivot, if we may, and take a look at his personal life, because why not? Plus, it can explain a few themes of his work. Now, if you were with us last month, you learned about William Godwin. Similar to the beliefs of William Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, Wilkie Collins was completely against the idea of marriage. So he had two separate families. One with the widow Caroline Graves, who you see on your right, with whom he lived with most of his adult life and treated her daughter like his own. She actually wanted to marry Collins. In fact, she got very fed up with him at one point and she walked out on him when he was writing The Moonstone. She married a younger man, but the marriage didn't last, and at last she returned to Collins 2 years later. In his 40s, he began a relationship with this lovely lady we see here on the right, 19-year-old Martha Rudd, with whom he had 3 children. Now remember, A Woman in White explores identity, stolen identities, lost identities. Well, Collins assumed the name of William Dawson, and all the children of Martha Rudd took the last name of Dawson. So maybe perhaps his law degree came in handy for this arrangement. I don't know. Okay, so now that's it for that. I'm gonna leave the personal behind and get to Collins' writing life. Four books published. Ooh, can you hear me, Cindy?
You're breaking up a little.
Okay, how about now? Oh.
Yeah, but yeah, I can hear you.
I know, but I can hear me too. Okay, now I can. Okay, good. All right, so 4 books, thank you, by the way, for helping me out there. 4 books published during the 1860s, including The Woman in White and The Moonstone, established Collins as a master storyteller, trendsetter, innovator, and provocateur. And it also made him a wealthy man, and he also, as we know, supported many others. And this is where our literary star begins to dim. Collins' dear friend, Charles Dickens, died in 1870, and this affected him deeply. This loss, combined with his laudanum addiction and his illness, took a toll. Even writing was physically uncomfortable, and also his eyesight worsened. So now you add to this a shift in the subject matter from his famous detective sensation novel to social commentary, and as a result, his writing just overall suffers. and the last 20 years of his life, he split his time between Caroline, who lived with him at his home in Gloucester Place, and Martha, who was conveniently nearby. He died at 82 from a stroke, and his headstone reads, author of The Woman in White. So what is Colin's legacy? His work fell under the category at the time of sensation novel, but today we recognize the genre and call it detective or suspense fiction. His work, like Thomas Hardy, exposed the plight of women. It addresses the absurdity also of the law applied to children of unmarried parents. As his success grew, his writing gravitated away from the thriller and toward the social. The poet Swinburne commented, quote, "What brought good Wilkie's genius nigh perdition? Some demon whispered, 'Wilkie, I have a mission.'" I think what Swinburne is saying about Collins is that with privilege of those who are popular, for one thing, and in Wilkie's case, it was his signature sensation novel, that they now feel they have a platform to talk about anything else. And in this case, his was social commentary, as I explained. So we too can imagine Swinburne's complaint today as we listen to famous folk opine on everything from Suzanne Summers' miracle exercise equipment, John Bon Jovi feeding the hungry, Brad Pitt building homes in the Ninth Ward, Seth Rogen's pottery, the pillow guy. I don't know, it seems that once you have fame for good or bad, Pandora's out of the box and we can't shut these people up. The greater question about The Woman in White is why? Why do we want to feel tense or scared? Scholarship tells us, quote, "The sensation novel forges a connection between text and reader as physical sensations move beyond the pages and seize the reader's body," unquote. Think about it. The physical experience of chills and raised heart rate while reading, this is an incredible feat of the brain. It's as if a deal is struck between a reader's logic and the writer's message. Fear, anxiety, these sensations, when related to real life, are not positive. They are fight or flight reactions. Picture yourself sitting alone with bound paper in your hand or a tablet, and the words triggering goosebumps, elevated heart rate, or that feeling that someone is watching you. You buy in subconsciously to this reading experience, even though logically none of it is happening. It's not like a play where you see it or music where you feel it and hear it. It isn't painting. It's this emotional transaction. It's a silent response. And yet you trust the experience. Why? Because Collins is a masterful storyteller. He is a man of his word, or in this case, of his words. We trust him to let ourselves be emotionally vulnerable. He constructs nervousness in his writing that is palpable and uncomfortable. With each chapter, the narrative unfolds, explaining this heartbreaking disappearance of Laura, and the reader has to choose. Read further, which could reveal even more awful evil, or withhold turning the page and never know the outcome. Now, all of that alone is unnerving, but we are also feeling uncomfortable that we have to make a choice. And then we are unsettled by the story itself. And furthermore, Laura, our main character, is mute. We never hear from her. All the clues to her fate are only revealed through us figuring out what is fact, what is fiction. Who can be trusted on this merry-go-round of desperate depositions? Even reading older sister Marion's diary makes us feel kind of dirty. We are right there with the evil Count Fosco as we witness his prying eyes, Worse, we're watching him read the diary and we get to see what's in it. We become accessories to the crime. From Marion's pages, we know she feels threatened by us vicariously. She even confesses about her hesitancy to confess in her own personal diary. She says, "How can I write about this? Yet I must," or "I am almost afraid to confess it, even on my secret pages," unquote. This is not like reading an old Southern Living magazine and staring at the fish tank at the orthodontist. As we move through the book, Colin reveals more possibilities of what could have gone so wrong. But realistically, we can always turn to the last page, or we can pull up the film on Amazon Prime. So why don't we? Because we are having a quality experience. We willingly sit, reading about uncomfortable situations that frazzle our nerves. It sounds completely nuts, but it's not, because Collins delivers. By writing so brilliantly, so skillfully, building a Jenga of mystery, offering us information to fill in the fragmented story, we give way our reality and, quote, surrender our privileged position as readers to whom all secrets are open by forgetting our knowledge for the pleasure of suspense and surprise. And what is more comfortable than a soft t-shirt? Wilkie Collins' influence can even be found here on Etsy, where you can buy a t-shirt with the book, Woman in White, right on it. What could be a more cultural homage than being a product that you could buy with the click of a button? We can allow ourselves to enjoy the mysterious works like A Woman in White because Collins gifts us with wonderful storytelling that still inspire writers and evidently shoppers. Thus, we can be comfortably mysterious. So the bottom line is this: I had no idea that Collins' work influenced so much of what we read or watch today. From the mystery set in the typical murky London fog to the galactic outer space conflicts solved by the Star Trek Enterprise's Dr. Spock, his style was first, his style was sensational. And speaking of first, speaking of sensational, and speaking of the mysterious, I now welcome my partner in all things comfortably mysterious, my dear friend Cindy.
Wow, Stacey, that was fantastic. I hope everyone enjoyed learning about the Woman in White. And I hope you also have a little patience, because it's in terms of our time, I might go over a little bit over past 8 o'clock. So I just ask your patience. Can you advance the slide for me? Tonight, we're going to be focusing on the artist, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, whose dates you can see 1834 to 1903. And he has some surprising connections with Wilkie Collins and the influential Woman in White. And we'll talk about those as we move along. But I wanted you to see these two portraits because they're so in the style of Rembrandt, and it should give you a sense of the flair of the dramatic that Whistler just exudes his entire life. So first, though, we're going to turn our attention to the color white, since it's so prominent in the book and also the painting that we will be discussing. So if you'd move to the next, please. Now, why white, do you think? What is it about the color white that influenced ancient cultures since the dawn of time? And it's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament numerous times. Technically, pure white is the absence of color. In other words, you can't mix colors to make white or create white. And it's been a symbol of purity for thousands of years. If you look at the slide, you'll see a page from the Book of the Dead, and the priestesses and even some of the Egyptian gods are wearing white. You've got the Vestal Virgins, don't you just love them, from ancient Rome? And of course, Greek temples were clad in white. They were off, some parts of them were painted, but mostly white marble. And then of course, the Pope is dressed, his vestments are primarily white. So like all colors, white possesses its own unique psychological meanings: virginity, virtuousness, of course, purity, goodness, cleanliness, brilliance, illumination, and new beginnings are just a few. If you'd go to the next for me, Stacey. So how is it that in the 19th century, Wilkie Collins and James Whistler capitalized on using white in their works and reinforcing the Victorian public's fascination with melodramas and mysteries to promote irony? Or was white a way for an artist to have the last laugh on the public? Perhaps after looking at Symphony in white, Whistler's early important painting, he was suggesting a very different meaning for the color. You'll soon be able to draw your own conclusion. And in any event, both Collins and Whistler challenged existing norms, and the art world and the literary world haven't been the same since. So what do you think about when you hear the name James Abbott McNeill Whistler? Perhaps too many middle names? Perhaps his puritanical mother, Anna, who we see on the screen, painted in 1871 by her long-suffering son in London, where he lived and where she came for a visit and stayed 11 years. He unsentimentalized her in this, his most famous picture, by turning the composition into an arrangement of geometric shapes, a very spare palette, hardly any color whatsoever, and flattened his dear old mom into a pancake. Remember the old days of Blockbuster video cutouts? And can we talk about her legs? The New Yorker art critic Peter Sheldall suggests that her legs look like, quote, the anatomy of an NBA draft pick. They seem to just be very, very long. I couldn't resist the basketball reference for several important people in my life. So even though the portrait of Anna Whistler became a symbol of motherhood, Whistler regarded the painting and all his paintings as decoratively arranged surfaces. Hence the name of the painting is not Whistler's Mother, it's Arrangement in Gray and Black #1. According to our favorite Australian art historian, Robert Hughes, the late Robert Hughes, the title of the work is important as it, quote, subordinates the moral and psychological associations of motherhood to the purely aesthetic or formal arrangement of tones. And we get it, right? We get it. And we get her strict New England character. Especially if you look at her photo, you're not going to be surprised that when the artist was young, Anna read Bible verses to him every morning, hoping to keep him from becoming an artist or pursuing art. And you see how well that worked. By the way, this is the first painting that the French state bought of an American, by an American artist of an American picture. And it's now in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. So, and the next slide is just something I thought you would enjoy, especially considering we've all been assaulted with memes lately. And you've got two hard characters, two hard-edged New Englanders side by side here. And I just thought that would be fun for you to see. Okay, next, please. Perhaps you think about Whistler's status as a dandy with his cane that he always had and his monocle that he wore all the time, or even what looks like a piece of dust at the top of the portrait on the right is actually a shock of white hair in his black head. He had a head full of black curls, and he often tied that white shock of hair with a bow. And he was usually with the top hat that you see in the photograph of him on the right. He is the person on the right side of that very kind of grainy black and white photo taken around 1885. And that's the painting on the left was painted by a very fine, well-known American artist named William Merritt Chase. And Chase was younger than Whistler, and he admired Whistler, and he wanted to befriend Whistler. And however, unfortunately, the result of this painting saw itself in the breakup of this very dear friendship, because Whistler denounced this picture, calling it a mockery and a lampoon. So, and oddly, or funny enough, Whistler painted a portrait of Chase, but no one has ever seen it, because once Whistler got annoyed with Chase, he either painted over it or somehow, it's lost to posterity. But it does show us this painting, how immaculately dressed Whistler was. He was well groomed. He was known as a gadfly at this point in his life. And yet he transforms himself into a work of art. Let's go to the next, if we could, Stacey. My projectionist. And did you know about his special signature, if you know about Whistler? He was never one to follow convention, and the slide shows the progression of his initials to the iconic butterfly that he used in his later works. Why a butterfly? Well, upon arrival in London in the late 1850s, Whistler began a love affair with all things Japanese. And he's not the only artist who does that. Remember good old Commodore Perry from American history, or maybe from world history, who opened up Japan. And when that happened, all kinds of objects and goods flooded France and England. And Whistler started collecting Japanese woodblock prints like the kind you see on the right, the Hiroshige's woodblock print from the 100 Famous Views of Edo. And then porcelain. The painting on the left is an oil on canvas by Whistler of a woman painting blue and white Chinese porcelain, as well as some images from Whistler's own collection. And so what he related to included the simplicity of Japanese art, the unusual perspectives. Usually in Western art, we know from the time of the Renaissance on, Western art, we look at something with the view of the linear perspective, two points that form a vanishing point on the canvas. Asian art, in particular, Japanese art here specifically that we're talking about, is more of a bird's eye view. It's not traditional, and that's what appealed to the artist at the time. Monet collected Japanese art. Van Gogh collected Japanese art, and this elegance influenced Whistler's developing aesthetic. And he studied potter's marks on the back of his pottery, and that's what led him to design his monogram. And that turned into, as I said, the butterfly. And Whistler always had to be different. He was very edgy. He always pushed the artistic envelope. And let's move to the next slide, if we could. And Whistler was a self-invented personality. And you're going to love this when I tell you that he even told people all his adult life that he was a Southern gentleman. But as you see from the slide, Whistler was born in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1834. And by the way, it's not even South Boston. Lowell is due west of Boston. And at the age of 8, Whistler's father, Major George Washington Whistler of West Point fame, and also a very well-known civil engineer, Major Whistler, the father of James Whistler, was tapped by Tsar Nicholas I to design the St. Petersburg to Moscow Railroad. So you can, and go to the next one if you would, Stacey, because I have the picture, I think, of the railroad. You can see one of the railroad bridges that he designed in St. Petersburg. And James spent formative years in St. Petersburg. He called it his Russian cradle. And he even studied art at the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts there. But regrettably, and most tragically, Major Whistler contracted cholera when he was 44 years old, and he died in 1849, which forced the family's return back to the United States. And you can see that there are two drawings on the bottom left and the far right of the slide here, because by 1851, Anna, God bless Anna Whistler, she pushed James into attending West Point Military Academy. And can you even imagine Whistler at West Point? That was the time when Robert E. Lee was the commandant. But other than art classes, he thought the atmosphere was oh so restrictive and was eventually expelled for flunking chemistry. A year later, next slide, please, at the age of 21, Whistler left for Paris, and he never returned to live in the United States. So he's known as an expatriate, along with John Singer Sargent, the other great 19th century American painter who painted a lot of society portraits. Whistler was an expatriate. He learned to become an artist by visiting the Louvre, that grand museum, perhaps the grandest museum in all the world. And it was at the Louvre that he copied Spanish greats like Velázquez, and certainly had his had an array of Rembrandts to choose from. And he studied Rembrandt and the works of the Dutch genius. And he was such a likable guy. He was very witty and funny, and somehow managed to ingratiate himself into an artistic fraternity that included Gustave Courbet, who was an artist who was changing the art world through the emphasis on realism. And he also befriended Edouard Manet and Edgar Degas, and his BFF was the painter of this particular work of art, Henri Fantin Latour. And this painting is called Homage to Delacroix, 1864. It's at the Musée d'Orsay. And Delacroix was the great French 19th century romantic painter. And Fantin Latour, who is seated in shirt sleeves with his artist's palette facing out toward us, decided that Delacroix had not been honored enough by the state. Most state luminaries would get wonderful funerals and lots of glory, but he felt like that they needed to do more for Delacroix, hence this painting, which is an assemblage of famous artists and famous writers. So guess who is front and center on the other side, standing with that mop of hair? Yes, that's our very own Whistler, looking out at us. And he's balanced by, on the far right, the well-known poet Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire is important to the development of the Impressionist movement in particular, because he was the one who told the painters like Monet and Manet. And Manet's the redheaded figure who's standing adjacent to Baudelaire. Baudelaire tells these artists to paint what is modern, paint real life, paint what you see on the streets or at the cafes, if you will. And so it's fascinating to me how quickly, at the time that this was painted, Whistler was only 30 years old. So think about it. Here you have these, this is like a pantheon of the greats. And by the way, he not only did he ingratiate himself into the artistic and literary world, but he also became, and not that Proust is not in the painting, but he certainly befriended Marcel Proust, and Proust mentions him in the Remembrance of Things Past. So you have to figure that this guy had a lot of personality and a lot of what I would call chutzpah, that is a lot of brazen nerve. And by the way, if you were to mention, this is for my dear friend Stacey, if you were to mention that this group portrait reminded you of Hals or Rembrandt, you would get extra credit if I were giving out grades today. Thank you, Stacey. All right, let's go to the next. Or you might have thought Whistler's ill-fated 1878 lawsuit against the critic, the supreme art critic of England, John Ruskin, or as some other critics have described the lawsuit as a, quote, suicide mission. It was definitely the worst blow to his career and was entirely self-inflicted against this well-known art critic, because Whistler sues Ruskin over Ruskin's scathing review of Whistler's painting that you see on the left of the slide here, the Nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket from 1872 to 75. Ruskin despised Whistler's impressionistic style here, and he let loose in 1878, Ruskin did, saying, quote, "This ill-educated conceit of the artist," meaning Whistler, "approached the aspect of willful imposture. I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb." Now, if you're like me, I didn't know what a coxcomb was. I had to consult my dictionary. It's a conceited, foolish dandy. But never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. And let me repeat that, for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Needless to say, unquote, sorry. Needless to say, the press went berserk, as Ruskin was viewed, as I said, the supreme English authority on art. Never one to back down from a fight, Whistler sued the critic for libel, and in hindsight, maybe not such a good idea. Even though Whistler won in court, it was a Pyrrhic victory. That is, the judge awarded him 1 farthing, which was a quarter of a penny, less than a quarter of a penny, excuse me, in damages. However, he was forced to pay the court costs, which cost him dearly. It bankrupted him. He lost his home and his collection of Japanese art and Chinese porcelain, everything. But fear not, and I won't have time to go into the rest of his life, but I will tell you that he managed to be like a phoenix and rise out of the ruins of his ill-fated lawsuit. And then next, please. And some of you may know about his aesthetic philosophy known as art for art's sake. Whistler was not the first person to use the term art for art's sake, but he became its greatest advocate. And you can read, if you would, what he said on the screen. And I want to just say this, that it really was aesthetics that were on trial in 1878. And it was the artist's ability to choose his or her own subject matter, which didn't have to tell a story or have a moral value. And by advancing this philosophy, art for art's sake, Whistler opens the door for the great modernist movements of the 20th century. And he really deserves a lot of credit for that. If you think about Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko or Willem de Kooning or Barnett Newman or my sweet daughter's favorite, Helen Frankenthaler, those works give primacy to the elements of art. Well, all those artists stood on his shoulders, and they were able to go deeper into what he fought for. So what have we actually learned about Mr. Whistler before we look at the painting Symphony in White, the White Girl? We learned that he was a renegade. He was an innovator. He was an artist who thought a painting should have no subject in the conventional sense. And he thought that art should appeal directly to our eye without relying on any ideas or emotions. And that is what is significant. That is really among his most essential contribution to the history of art. So now that we know a little bit about him, let's enter the Symphony in White, number 1, if we could, which was the painting that you see on the screen. And that's really the painting that made Whistler's reputation. It is life-size. It's about 7.5 by 3.5 feet. And it's at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. I bet many of you have even seen it. And it was started in Paris in 1861. And it's a portrait. And I have these other 3 portraits for you to see. They're oh so beautiful. One is a Titian, the one on the far left, that's Isabella d'Este. The middle is a Gainsborough, Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheridan. And the one on the far right is, Lady Agnew by John Singer Sargent. And I wanted you to see these in comparison to Whistler's portrait, because his portrait is not a traditional portrait in the traditional sense. According to Charles Brock, who is an art historian, he said, quote, it fundamentally reoriented the relationship between artist, subject, and viewer, end quote. So with artists like the ones that you see on the screen, the name of the person who commissioned the painting, that would be the name of the painting. And this idea of grand manner, the grand manner of portraiture, was the opposite of the white girl, whose title didn't make sense to anyone, whose model really wasn't specifically identified. This painting isn't called Josephine Heffernan, it's called The White Girl, and whose subject matter was definitely ambiguous. But we do know the name of the model, Joanna Heffernan, known as Jo, and she was described as a working class Irish Catholic, a woman of next to very little education, but of very keen intelligence, and who knew a lot about art, and really was, she probably read all the Wilkie Collins books that Stacey discussed tonight, and apparently she had a very charming personality. But interestingly enough, it's also been said that Whistler lived in mortal fear of her. Well, who knows? They met in London in 1860. She was 17, he was 26. Regrettably, she dies at 43. Not much is known about her after she breaks up with Whistler 6 years later, although we do know she models for Courbet, as my granddaughter would say, ooh la la. We don't have time for that tonight, unfortunately. But as Whistler's muse, she was a model and mistress, and she posed for him and was in every major painting of his early career. And she had a lot going for her. She was beautiful. She had beautiful coloring, expressive eyes, a strong sense of style. It is said that they love nothing better than getting dressed up in all kinds of the most fashionable clothing and going out to, bars and parties and going out for the night life. And by the way, there is a new book about her that I highly recommend, because it fills in the gaps of her life and gives her credit as a partner or a collaborator in the painting process. And I think it's really timely that this is about the third book that's come out about male artists and the women who pose for them, and the contributions that the women have never been given their due, and they finally are now. And it's really quite extraordinary. And so that's why we're able to know so much more about her, even though after she leaves Whistler, there's only speculation, and I didn't want to bombard you with that. I will tell you there's going to be an exhibit in 2022 at the Royal Academy in London and in Washington with nearly all the images that Whistler made of her. So if we look at the painting, and is the next one the close-up, Stacey? I think it's a little, there's one. Yeah, let's just look at that one. Well, yeah, we can look at that, sure. Everywhere we look, we see, yes, that's better. We see White and this full-length red-haired Jo standing against a window where the light is filtered and through a decorated white curtain. It's woven curtain. And the fabric is dotted with Japanese designs. She wears this simple long white dress that pools around her feet, creating a shallow sense of space. And the way her gown hung was seen as a display of poor taste. So I'm just starting to give you some of the hints of why people were so annoyed. Critics and the public were so annoyed with this work. She's standing on a rug, and depending on your choice of critters, of either a bear or a wolf pelt, the little rounded ears. Do you mind going to the detail of that next one. The little rounded ears make us lean toward the bear, which was viewed by the critics as a symbol of male lust. And the other thing is, I know I'm giving people whiplash here, but go back to the main one, if you would. Yeah. Did you notice that the perspective is distorted here? The floor seems to slant toward us, making her appear to hover over the rug rather than feet firmly planted on the ground. And her face is just, now we'll focus on the close-ups. It's time for your close-up, Mrs. DeMille. Okay. Her face reveals no expression, no emotion. She's almost an automaton with a trance-like expression. And her lips are full red lips. And she has this head of this sort of reddish, copperish colored hair that Whistler described as Venetian. You know, you gotta love Titian, right? If you're a colorist like he was, you gotta love Titian, Venetian. And, you know, clearly it looks like she has bed head, you know, bed hair. She looks like she just, you know, rolled out of bed. She didn't put a brush in her hair or a comb. And she's certainly, when we look at her full body, we see she's got, her arms are limp, and she could not be more awkward, is what I'm trying to say. And now if we go to the lower part, you know, when you compare the bear below, and if you see the mouth here with the fangs and the blood red tongue, and the bear is looking at us directly, and it gives us the chills, just like Mr. Collins did with his narrative. Well, this bear has more energy than the model, and maybe she needs a tonic. I don't know. She needs something to get her going, a jolt maybe. She stands amidst purple and yellow pansies that have been dropped on top of the bear rug. They were secret symbols of courting in Victorian society. And the rug itself is patterned, it's Chinese. And these, the rug, the pansies, and the bear, you know, make a very strong contrast to the white. And Whistler ignored normal conventions and expectations in other ways as well. The paint was applied unevenly. You know, that would have been an F on a art course at the academy. He didn't really go to the academy, so I guess he didn't really mind that. The paint is thinner over her face than the background. These again are definite no-nos at the time, including the fact that the brush strokes are so visible, and as well as ignoring the traditional perspective. And you know, this painting should have been by all rights smooth and have a uniform finish. And the critics just went bananas because they bristled that they thought he left it purposefully unfinished. They decried her casual blankness and her overall attitude, and they said that she was, quote, devoid of feminine grace. And they said also that her mannerisms have the appearance of affectation and are not in unison with the true spirit of art. And that's a real understatement. The true spirit of art would not be the same after Mr. Whistler. But here's what really grated: that the work did not seem to be about anything. No story, no history, no religion, no nature, no moral. Now, I want to just show you quickly, and I recognize that unfortunately, my darling partner and I've run out of time, and I just really feel terrible because I'm not going to get finished.
Please keep going.
Well,
I'm reading the chat, and people are asking you to keep going.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Please.
I feel really okay. Keep going with the slides. So I want to just show you a work of art painted the very same year. And it really helps you understand what all the fuss was about. And the artist, Charles Chaplin, was an academic painter. And you see the title of this work, it's Reflection. So you understand there's a mirror. So this demure miss who's holding the posies in her satin gown, her satin shoes, and her very demure head is looking at sideways to the mirror, and yet she's also maybe having a contemplative thought. So she's looking at her physical self, but she's also into her inner self. And so all these things indicate her status, that she's respectable. And I could say a lot more about her, but all I would say is it's useful to contrast her with the Symphony in white, the white girl, because it tells us nothing, like I said before. So it's no surprise that when Whistler went to share this painting, because he could hardly wait, he was so excited about it. He went to the Royal Academy Summer Show of 1862, and he entered it into the exhibition. And typical of the way that the Royal Academy process worked, he wasn't contacted. He didn't know one way or another whether or not it was rejected, the painting was rejected or accepted. He just had to wait till it opened. And when he went, he searched room after room upstairs. And when he didn't find the work, he went downstairs and found it in the basement, like leaning against a wall. So that's really sad and tragic. So what did he do? Let's go to the next slide if we could. He was really anxious for the work to be seen because he thought it was original. He thought it was fresh. And I couldn't find an image of the small art gallery. It's off Oxford Street, if you know London, but it's called the Berners Street Gallery. And he took it there because they agreed to show it. And it caused a sensation. And one of the things that happened is that the manager and the owners of the Berners Street Gallery decided that because The Woman in White was such a successful novel, that they would title this painting The Woman in White. Now remember that at the time, it was called The White Girl. Whistler doesn't change the name until 10 years later. And I'll tell you why in a second. So in other words, the gallery gave it the title, The Woman in White. And here's where our sensational painting intersects with Mr. Collins's sensational novel. One critic complained that it was the most incomplete painting that we've ever met with. The face is well done. Everybody has an opinion, but it's not that of Mr. Wilkie Collins' Woman in White. While Whistler didn't object to the mistitling or the misreading of his painting for commercial purposes, he objected to such misunderstandings that led to a bad review. And we know this, can you move to the next one? Because he made a drawing about it. Next, please, Stacey. We know this because he made a drawing about it to one of his friends, showing a man that reminds me of W.C. Fields, the comedian, and Whistler drew this. And you see this man walking around London advertising Whistler, he didn't even spell his name correctly, painting called The Woman in White. And Whistler responded to the review of his painting this way, quote, "May I beg to correct an erroneous impression likely to be confirmed by a paragraph in your last number? The proprietors of the Berners Street Gallery have, without my sanction, called my picture The Woman in White. I had no intention whatsoever of illustrating Mr. Wilkie Collins' novel. It so happens that, indeed, I have never read it." So there. My painting simply represents a girl dressed in white standing in front of a white curtain, end quote. So I'm going to move along here. What I'd like to just tell you that Whistler, like Collins, did not give much in the way of explanations as to the identity of the woman in the painting, and the linking of the painting to the book only brought more attention to both, which of course he was pleased. He renamed the painting 10 years later, calling it Symphony in White, #1. And this was because he made 2 more versions of not just this particular painting, but he made 2 more paintings of women in white. And the second one was called Symphony in White #2, and then on and on. So why did he do this? Well, he wanted to imply that the painting was purely an aesthetic experience like music, and it was not connected to reality. So he wanted you to get, feel this sort of musical sensation when looking at the work. So after it was rejected at the Royal Academy, he submitted it to the Paris Salon of 1863, which, if you've studied art history in the 19th century, no, if you studied 19th century art history, not in the 19th century, if any of you remember that this was the salon that had almost 5,000 entries, and over half of them were rejected, forcing the president of France, Napoleon III, to have a second exhibition, and it was called a Salon des Refusés, meaning the rejected paintings. And of course, the two most infamous paintings that were rejected included Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe and Whistler's Symphony in White. And of course, the French had plenty to say about Whistler, but I guess the most striking criticisms included that she was a fallen ex-virgin, a victim of mesmerism, which is animal magnetism. I guess that bear just really did it. The bottom line here is that the work continues to pose more questions than answers. Surely Jo personifies multiple identities. Was she a muse? Yes. Was she a virgin? Sorry, not happening. Was she his lover? Yes. Was she a bride? Not a bride either. Prostitute? Well, I really hate calling her a prostitute, so you can call her whatever you'd like. And fallen woman, I don't think but that's what some of the critics described her as. But as art historian Charles Brock writes, quote, "The most significant achievement of this painting is how Whistler and Jo poke fun at grand manner portraiture that was completely at odds with a convention." And he says, going further, "The White Girl was the freelance work of a struggling artist without a clear national identity, and he was a rascal," end quote. In the end, it's really a painting about art making, an unpopular visual experiment, which brought great notoriety to the artist. Poet Stefan Mallarmé said, "Whistler aimed to paint not the thing, but the effect it produces." And I really think that's the perfect description. He was after the effect of the color here, the color white, and the white flower that has fallen in her hand. It hangs there limply. Now, if we had time, I was going to talk about some contemporary work to connect it. But what I think we'll do, we'll flip through those, Stacey. These are artists who were influenced by Whistler, and you can see they include the Impressionist Morisot, who's, I don't think I have time to comment on these. So let's just move along, okay? The other is a Belgian artist. I would comment on the John Singer Sargent because it's just so fascinating. He painted this in Morocco, and it is a woman, like a woman who is breathing smoke. Are you ready? It's too wonderful not to share. The smoke is the burning of a waxy substance that's extracted from whales. It's called ambergris, and it's used in rituals and said to have, this is of course why I liked it, aphrodisiac qualities. Okay, don't ever say that art history is not, shall we say, racy. Okay, let's move to the next. These are a couple of more images that, and the Evelyn Nesbit is just very close to the Woman in White, I think, or excuse me, the Symphony in White. And there is an image of her that I couldn't find where she's actually lying and her head is just adjacent to that polar bear. And she's only 16 at the time of this photograph. And then of course, George Bellows is one of the great 20th century American painters next. And then we even have one from 2000, it should be 2013, not 2003. Oh, okay. And this is by Vic Munoz. and it's called Symphony in White, #1, The White Girl After Whistler, and it's a chromatic digital print. So I'm going to close, and then I may let Stacey show us some of these other pictures that are fascinating. So both Wilkie Collins and James Whistler created new fields of art and literature, and they were part of the growing Victorian culture that commercialized pleasure and certainly brought comfort. And combined with the penny press, which largely influenced their success, as both became immediate sensations when they were debuted. Both Whistler and Collins involved mysteries about identity and legitimacy, and both challenged society's expectations of legitimate art. They continue to raise questions to this very day, and we certainly hope we've given you a great deal to consider this evening, especially some comfort and escape from reality. And don't forget that we will be addressing the Holocaust in poetry and in photography Thursday, April 22nd. We hope to see you then. Thank you.
Cindy, there were a few questions, but can you just speak to this piece? It's so beautiful.
Yes. So this is a piece by an African-American artist, Kerry James Marshall, and he grew up in LA, and he went to museums, and he never saw any artists or any works of art that had his that represented him or any Black people. And he decided that when he became an artist, that he would focus on rectifying that oversight, that horrible oversight, that along with a lot of women artists who have not been featured throughout the time of our history. And he says this, that Blackness is non-negotiable in his pictures. It is also unequivocal. They're Black. That's the thing I mean for people to identify with immediately. They're Black to demonstrate that Blackness can have complexity. And I understand he uses like 4 different shades of black in his facial and body parts. They have complexity, they have depth, they have richness. And so why did I pick him to show you as a counterpoint to all the white that we've seen tonight? Well, he examines Blackness within an art historical context, and I really love that about him. He focuses on the tradition of painting, about painting, which is what you see here, and it's Untitled. And this painting shows an artist, I mean, in all her glory. She's exquisite. She's prominent. Her easel practically takes up 1/3 of the painting. And if you notice, and her hat is also exquisite. She's just this beautiful figure. And if you look behind her, you see the painting, and the portrait she's painting is paint by numbers. And of course, we all know what that is. I remember doing paint by numbers when I was a child, and it's unfinished. And to me, this image brings to mind Whistler and his quest to make art for art's sake. But like Whistler, Kerry James Marshall throws us for a loop by using paint by numbers in the background and leaving it unfinished. And so this gaze that he uses of the female demands that we engage actively in the work, and we want to know more and admire his aesthetic sensibility. So this is interesting. The wall text when this work was exhibited said, quote, "The commanding presence of the figure is also an empowering one. If you're an artist of color, or if you're an artist who is a woman, the answer to the question, what does an artist look like? It might just be you," end quote. And I'm definitely stopping.
Well,
Oh, we prepare too much, Stacey. We have to
Cindy,
like
but
have
there's a few
conversation.
more questions that I think are incredibly important. So I wanted to bring one to your attention. There's a local connection to Whistler, says Jennifer. His mother was related to a branch of the Kingsley family and spent time here in their home off what's now University Boulevard, I believe. And I don't know
No way.
that
I
home.
did not know that.
Have you been to that home?
I have not. We need a field trip.
Yeah, it's stunning. That's incredibly interesting. And of course, Anna Kingsley has a very complicated history, fabulous history, American history, all our history as well. She's worth a field trip and an exploration also. There was also a question, Cindy, about the carbonated beverage, Delacroix. Is it at all related to Delacroix? And I'm wondering, are they riffing on his?
No.
No?
Not that I've ever heard ever. No.
It reminds you of the no, nothing.
No.
Okay, all right, just if
Yeah,
you're,
I thought it was pronounced LaCroix. Delacroix
it
is.
maybe
Yeah.
it is. I don't know what it. Why do you name something people have a hard time pronouncing?
I had a good question. Snobism, I guess.
Well,
Elitism.
there you go. There was also a question about what autofiction is, and if you search the New York Times, it's a very cute little article about our fixation on reading books and deciding that it must, the author's life must be a part of the book. Because the first rule of writing is write about what you know. But perfect examples of this gone completely awry would be the autobiography of an ex-colored man by James Weldon Johnson, who was brilliant in his title and creating the story, which you don't know whether to believe or not. The same can be said of Lolita, which I thought was absolutely
Oh my gosh.
beautiful book and was totally trashed by people who thought Nabokov was, this horrible person, and he was using his. Okay, so he liked butterflies. That's about the only commonality that you can make between Humbert and. But
Stacey, before everybody hangs up, well, I'm not going to talk about these, but show what else we were going to talk about, because you were like dying to know.
Okay.
About these two.
Well,
we were going to talk.
Well, talk about now. You can't just
no,
do that to people.
No, I don't want to talk about it. It's almost 8:30. We've been on an hour and a half. We can't.
Okay.
We'll talk about it next time after the Holocaust.
Okay. Okay. Oh my Lord. Okay. On that fine note, I want to thank Cindy. Do you want to say thank you to everyone?
Thank you all for sticking around. You're very kind, and we really enjoy this, and we do over prepare. I'm going to get a word from my husband, I'm sure, in a minute about this. But
yeah, we need a director's cut or therapy or a little of both. But we appreciate all of you coming this evening, but we can't wait to be together again soon, right?
Yes, yes.
Well, everyone have a wonderful evening, and we will see you.
Thank you.
Be well.
Oops.